"I want a divorce," my husband announced at our 40th anniversary party, raising his champagne glass as if he were proposing a toast instead of ending our marriage. The crystal chandelier above us shimmered, scattering soft light across the ballroom we had rented at the Lakeside Country Club, a place we had visited every summer for nearly 3 decades, and for a brief second I truly believed he was about to thank me for the years we had built together. I was standing to his right in a navy silk dress I had chosen carefully, something elegant but not flashy, something a woman of 68 could wear with quiet confidence, and I felt every eye in that room turn toward me at once. There were almost 80 guests, our children, business associates, neighbors, friends from church, and the string quartet we hired kept playing for 2 confused seconds before the music faltered into silence. I remember thinking how steady my hands were as I held my glass. I remember noticing that the champagne did not ripple. Thomas cleared his throat like he was about to discuss quarterly earnings. He spoke about change, about new chapters, about how life was too short to stay in situations that no longer served you. The words sounded rehearsed, polished, almost corporate. 40 years of marriage reduced to a strategic pivot. Someone near the back gave a nervous laugh, assuming this was a joke, some odd attempt at humor. It wasn't. I could see it in the set of his jaw. I could see it in the way he avoided looking at me directly. Instead, he stared at the crowd, at the mahogany bar, at anything but the woman who had stood beside him since he was 29 and drowning in debt. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. My daughter Claire gasped softly. Our son Michael looked as if he had swallowed something sharp. And still I smiled. Not a trembling smile. Not the brittle kind you force when you're about to cry. A calm one. The kind I used to wear when Thomas would come home frustrated from the office and needed someone steady to lean against. I set my glass down on the white linen tablecloth and folded my hands in front of me. The cake behind us, 3 tiers decorated with sugar roses, suddenly looked absurd. 40 years of love, it said in gold lettering. I wondered how long he had been planning this moment. How many nights he had practiced the speech in his study while I was upstairs reading. How many quiet dinners he had sat through knowing he would eventually detonate our life in front of everyone we knew. I should have felt blindsided. That is what people expect from a woman publicly discarded. Tears. Anger. A dramatic exit. Instead, I felt something colder. A clarity that had been building for weeks. Because the truth is, this was not the first signal. 3 days earlier, I had found an envelope tucked inside his briefcase while searching for a receipt. It was from a law firm downtown, one of the largest in Chicago, and although it was sealed, the return address was enough. 2 days earlier, I noticed he had moved funds from our joint investment account into a new entity I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, he brushed me off with talk of portfolio restructuring. The night before the party, he slept in the guest room, claiming he didn't want to wrinkle his tuxedo. I lay awake alone in our king-sized bed and listened to the hum of the air conditioner, counting each breath, piecing together the puzzle I had been ignoring for months. So when he finally said the word divorce out loud, it did not land like a lightning strike. It landed like confirmation. Around us, the guests shifted uncomfortably. One of Thomas's business partners stared at his shoes. My sister-in-law covered her mouth. The waiter holding a tray of sparkling water stood frozen near the dance floor. Thomas finally glanced at me then, perhaps expecting a scene. Perhaps hoping I would storm out so he could frame himself as the composed one. Instead, I reached for the microphone he was still holding and gently took it from his hand. 40 years is a long time, I said, my voice carrying easily across the silent room. I did not raise it. I did not let it shake. And I suppose honesty, even when it's late, deserves acknowledgement. A few heads lifted. Thomas blinked, thrown off script. I could feel the weight of the moment. The collective inhale of an audience waiting for collapse. But collapse was not what I had prepared for. I had prepared for something else entirely. And as I stood there in the soft, golden light, looking at the man who thought he had just rewritten our story, I realized this was not the end of mine. It was only the first move in a game he mistakenly believed he was playing alone. The silence after my words felt heavier than his announcement had been, as if the room itself was waiting to see whether I would crumble or concede, but I did neither. I handed the microphone back to the stunned event coordinator and suggested that everyone please enjoy the dinner that had already been served, because the salmon would not taste any better if it grew cold. A few guests let out uncertain laughs, grateful for direction, and slowly the hum of conversation began to return, thin and fragile at first, like glass settling after being tapped. Thomas stood beside me, rigid, clearly unsettled that I had not reacted the way he had anticipated. He had always understood numbers, markets, leverage. He had never fully understood restraint. I moved through the crowd with deliberate calm, thanking people for coming, complimenting a neighbor on her emerald necklace, asking one of Thomas's associates about his recent retirement. I could feel the curiosity in their eyes, the sympathy, the questions they did not dare voice. But beneath the surface of their concern, I sensed something else as well. Surprise. They had expected a scene. Instead, they were witnessing composure. What they did not know was that composure had become my quiet discipline over the past week. 3 days before the party, after finding that envelope from the law firm, I did not confront Thomas. I did not even open it. I simply placed it back exactly where I had found it, and made an appointment of my own the following morning. The office I visited overlooked Lake Michigan. All steel and glass, modern and impersonal. I remember the way the receptionist offered me sparkling water and addressed me as Mrs. Whitmore, unaware that I was already rehearsing how to separate that name from the man attached to it. The attorney I met with, a woman in her early 50s named Diane Keller, listened more than she spoke. I explained the unusual transfers from our joint account, the newly formed limited liability company, the subtle distance that had crept into my husband's behavior over the past year. Diane did not appear shocked. She appeared prepared. She asked precise questions about property deeds, investment portfolios, beneficiary designations, and something Thomas had likely forgotten I kept carefully organized in our home safe. A revised postnuptial agreement we had signed 8 years earlier after a brief health scare, drafted at his insistence at the time to ensure financial clarity for our children. He had called it prudent planning. I had called it trust. Diane called it leverage. When I returned home that afternoon, Thomas was in his study, door closed, voice low as he spoke on the phone. I did not strain to hear. I no longer needed confirmation. That evening, I suggested we invite everyone important to us to celebrate our 40th anniversary in a grand way. He looked almost relieved, perhaps assuming I was clinging to tradition, unaware that I was giving him a stage. In the days that followed, I reviewed documents quietly while he finalized catering menus and floral arrangements. I requested copies of account statements from our financial advisor, under the pretense of updating estate paperwork. I located the notarized addendum to our agreement, and placed it in a slim ivory folder inside my evening clutch. Each action was small, each one deliberate. Back in the ballroom as guests began cutting into their meals, I watched Thomas from across the room. He was explaining something to his brother with animated gestures, likely attempting to frame the narrative before it formed on its own. He glanced at me once, perhaps searching for signs of anger or desperation. I gave him neither. Instead, I thought about the early years of our marriage, when we rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston and counted every dollar before grocery shopping. I thought about the nights I balanced our books at the kitchen table, while he pursued expansion plans that everyone else called reckless. I thought about the promotions, the relocations, the endless networking dinners where I stood beside him and helped polish the image that now stood under crystal chandeliers announcing his independence. He believed tonight marked his liberation. What he did not understand was that preparation changes the balance of power long before a single word is spoken aloud. And as dessert plates were cleared and the string quartet cautiously resumed a softer melody, I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Not heartbreak. Strategy. By the time the last of the guests drifted toward the valet stand and the ballroom lights dimmed to a softer glow, the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if something irreversible had already taken place even though nothing practical had yet been decided. Thomas was near the entrance shaking hands, thanking people for coming, accepting sympathetic pats on the shoulder, as though he were the one enduring a difficult transition. I stood a few feet away speaking quietly with Claire, who kept searching my face for cracks. "Are you all right?" she asked in a whisper that trembled more than I would have liked. I smoothed a stray strand of her hair behind her ear and told her I was steady, which was the truth. Steady did not mean untouched. It meant anchored. When we finally stepped outside into the cool evening air, the lake breeze lifted the hem of my dress and carried away the scent of champagne and candle wax. Thomas approached me beside the black town car we had arranged for the night, his expression a mixture of defensiveness and impatience. "We should talk when we get home," he said, his voice low, careful not to create another scene in front of the remaining guests. I nodded. "Of course," I replied, as if we were discussing landscaping plans rather than the dismantling of a life. The drive back to our house in Winnetka took 20 minutes, and in that span of time he spoke only once, explaining that he had not intended to embarrass me, that he believed transparency was more respectful than secrecy. I listened without interrupting. Outside the window, the streetlights passed in steady intervals, illuminating manicured lawns and familiar brick facades, all the symbols of stability we had spent decades constructing. When we entered the house, the foyer felt unusually large. The marble floor reflected the overhead chandelier in a way that made the space seem almost hollow. Thomas removed his tuxedo jacket and loosened his bow tie, exhaling as if relieved to have delivered a long-awaited speech. "I assume you understand this is not impulsive," he began, walking toward his study. "I have been considering this for some time." I followed him, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. His desk was immaculate, the leather chair angled slightly as though he had left it mid-decision. On the credenza sat a framed photograph from our 25th anniversary, both of us sunburned and laughing on a beach in Florida. I picked it up briefly, then set it back down. "I know," I said simply. He paused, perhaps expecting outrage, perhaps bracing for accusation. Instead he seemed unsettled by my agreement. "You know," he repeated. I met his eyes evenly. "I have noticed the account transfers, the meetings, the distance." A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he masked it with composure. "Then you understand why this is necessary," he said, defaulting to the language of efficiency. "Necessary," as though love were a contract expiring at the end of a fiscal quarter. I walked to the window overlooking our backyard where the pool lights cast a pale blue glow across the patio. That patio had hosted graduation parties, holiday dinners, countless summer evenings with neighbors and friends. I thought about the version of myself who had once believed that shared history guaranteed shared future. "You have made your decision," I said. "But decisions have consequences." He straightened slightly, the businessman re-emerging. "I have already retained counsel," he replied. "They will handle the formalities. I want this to be straightforward." Straightforward. The word lingered between us. I turned back toward him, my posture relaxed, my voice even. "I am glad you mentioned counsel," I said. "I met with someone as well." The silence that followed was subtle but unmistakable. Not explosive. Not dramatic. Just a shift, like the air pressure changing before a storm. He studied my face as if searching for a hint of bluff. I offered none. "There are details we will need to review," I continued, "especially regarding the postnuptial amendment from 8 years ago." His brow tightened almost imperceptibly. He had not expected me to remember that document, let alone understand its implications. I could see the calculations begin behind his eyes, the quiet reassessment of assumptions he had held too comfortably. For the first time that evening, he did not look entirely certain. And as I stood there in the dim blue light of our own backyard, I realized something important. He had believed he was unveiling a surprise. He had not considered that I might have been preparing one of my own. Thomas did not respond immediately when I mentioned the postnuptial amendment, and that pause told me more than any confession could have. He walked around his desk slowly, as if proximity to familiar leather and mahogany might restore his advantage. "That document was precautionary," he said finally, keeping his tone measured. "It does not change the broader picture." I studied him in the soft lamplight, noticing the faint lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years, lines I once associated with dedication and long hours of work. Now they looked more like strain. "Precautionary documents are drafted for moments exactly like this," I replied. "Otherwise they are just paper." He exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of irritation he had never quite managed to conceal. For decades I had been the one who absorbed his impatience, who translated his ambition into something socially graceful. I had hosted dinners for investors when we could barely afford catered food, smiling through evenings when he pitched expansion strategies that even I thought were reckless. I had stood beside him at charity galas, gently correcting his mispronunciations of French wine labels and smoothing over tense exchanges with board members. When he wanted to relocate to grow the company, I agreed without hesitation, leaving behind friends and a part-time teaching position I genuinely loved. I told myself that partnership meant adaptation. I believed that supporting his vision was also building our shared future. Somewhere along the way, support had become expectation, and expectation had quietly turned into entitlement. He walked to the built-in bar and poured himself a small glass of scotch, though he rarely drank on weeknights. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal tumbler. "I am not trying to erase our history," he said. "I simply want a different next chapter." A different next chapter. The phrase sounded almost rehearsed, something lifted from a self-help podcast. I thought about the countless nights I had sat at our kitchen island reviewing spreadsheets while he prepared presentations, making sure household expenses stayed balanced while he chased risk. I remembered the year the market dipped and we nearly lost the house. I had sold a set of heirloom bracelets from my grandmother to cover a shortfall in payroll, because he insisted his employees be paid on time. I did not resent that choice. I resented the way it had been forgotten. "Our history is not a decorative backdrop," I said quietly. "It is the foundation under everything you stand on." He looked at me then with something that resembled uncertainty. For a man accustomed to controlling negotiations, he seemed suddenly unsure of the terrain. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. I moved to the bookshelf and ran my fingers lightly across the spines of leather-bound annual reports from the early years of his company. My name was not printed on those covers. My effort was not recorded in quarterly summaries. Yet I knew the numbers in those pages by heart. "I am implying that the amendment you dismissed includes provisions you may have overlooked," I answered. "Provisions regarding asset division in the event of unilateral dissolution, initiated without mutual consent." His jaw tightened. He had signed that document during a time when his health had briefly faltered and vulnerability had made him cautious. He had wanted reassurance that I would be secure if anything happened to him. What he had not anticipated was that the language protecting me in widowhood would also protect me in abandonment. The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air heavier with unspoken recalculations. Outside, the pool lights flickered as the automatic timer prepared to shut them off for the night. I glanced toward the hallway where framed photographs traced our decades together. Birthdays, graduations, vacations along the Pacific Coast Highway, our children's first apartments. I did not feel rage when I looked at them. I felt clarity. "You believe tonight would put me on the defensive," I said evenly. "But I have had days to consider what comes next." He set his glass down more forcefully than necessary, the ice shifting sharply. "Are you threatening me?" he asked. I held his gaze without blinking. "No," I replied. "I am reminding you that I was never as uninformed as you assumed." And in that quiet study, beneath the watchful eyes of photographs documenting 40 years of shared effort, I understood that the real shift had already occurred. He had expected resistance. What he encountered instead was resolve. Thomas did not argue further that night, and that restraint told me he was recalculating rather than retreating. He gathered a few papers from his desk, straightened the edges as though aligning them might restore order, and said we would let our attorneys communicate from this point forward. The formality in his voice sounded almost theatrical inside the house we had filled with laughter, arguments, music, and long Sunday mornings for 4 decades. I nodded once and left the study without another word. Upstairs, I removed my earrings carefully and placed them in the velvet box on my dresser, the same box he had given me on our 10th anniversary when his first major contract finally closed. I caught my reflection in the mirror and studied the woman staring back at me. There were faint lines around my mouth, silver threaded through my hair, but there was no panic in my eyes, only awareness. I changed into a soft gray robe and sat at the small writing desk near the bedroom window. The backyard lights had shut off completely, leaving only a dim glow from the neighboring houses. I opened my laptop and reviewed the scanned copy of the amendment Diane had sent earlier that afternoon. The language was clear. In the event that one spouse initiated dissolution without mutual agreement, and after transferring or attempting to transfer marital assets into separate entities without written consent, the injured spouse would retain controlling interest in specified holdings, including the original corporate shares registered under the family trust. Thomas had always focused on expansion and new ventures. He had forgotten that the earliest shares, the ones purchased when we refinanced the house and signed personal guarantees, were tied to both our names. I remembered sitting at a bank in downtown Chicago 35 years ago, my hand trembling slightly as I signed those guarantees, aware that if his idea failed we would lose everything. Back then we were partners in risk. Somewhere along the years, he began to see risk as solely his to take and reward as solely his to claim. The next morning I woke before sunrise, a habit formed during the years when I packed school lunches and managed early conference calls on his behalf. The house felt unusually quiet, though Thomas was already downstairs. I could hear the faint murmur of his voice in the kitchen, likely speaking with his attorney. I dressed in a simple navy suit and pearls, nothing dramatic, nothing defensive. At breakfast, we sat across from one another at the long oak table we had chosen together at an antique store in Michigan. He sipped black coffee and avoided my gaze. "My attorney will send over preliminary terms by Friday," he said, his tone clipped. "I expect this to proceed efficiently." I spread a thin layer of jam on my toast and nodded. "Efficiency depends on accuracy," I replied. "I will be reviewing everything carefully." He seemed about to say something more, then stopped himself. Perhaps he was waiting for me to ask about the other woman if there was one. Perhaps he wanted the confrontation to justify his decision. I offered him none. My focus was not on speculation. It was on documentation. After he left for the office, I drove into the city to meet Diane again. Traffic along Interstate 94 moved steadily, and I found comfort in the predictability of lanes and signals. Inside the law office, the atmosphere felt controlled, almost serene. Diane reviewed the financial disclosures Thomas had already begun submitting. "He underestimated you," she said plainly, sliding a page across the polished conference table. "The timing of his transfers is significant." I traced the dates with my finger, noting how closely they aligned with the anniversary party planning. He had intended to celebrate publicly while quietly rearranging the ground beneath my feet. What he did not realize was that foundations reinforced over decades do not collapse overnight. "I do not want theatrics," I told Diane. "I want fairness." She studied me for a moment before nodding. "Fairness can be very precise," she replied. As I left the office and stepped back into the bright Chicago afternoon, I felt something solidify within me. This was no longer about humiliation or pride. It was about recognition. Recognition of years invested, risks shared, sacrifices absorbed without applause. Thomas believed he had chosen the timing. What he had not chosen was the outcome. And as I drove home past the skyline we once admired as a symbol of our shared ambition, I understood that the next conversation would not revolve around whether our marriage was ending. It would revolve around who truly understood the terms. The preliminary terms arrived 3 days later in a thick envelope delivered by courier, as though the weight of the paper itself might intimidate me into compliance. I was seated at the kitchen island when the doorbell rang, sunlight spilling across the granite countertops and catching the edge of the silver fruit bowl we had received as a wedding gift decades ago. I signed for the package calmly and placed it in front of me without opening it immediately. Thomas was at the far end of the house in his study, the door partially closed, likely aware of what had just been delivered. The house felt divided in a way it never had before. Not physically but strategically. I ran my hand over the envelope, then retrieved a letter opener from the drawer. Inside were neatly printed pages outlining proposed asset distribution, real estate division, and a timeline that moved with impressive speed. The tone was polite, almost generous at first glance. I was to retain the house in Winnetka, though subject to refinancing within 90 days. A fixed monthly support payment was listed, calculated with precision but stripped of context, as if 40 years could be converted into a formula. The language was efficient. It was also incomplete. There was no mention of the original share allocations tied to the family trust. No acknowledgement of the clause triggered by unilateral asset transfers. He had presented an offer built on the assumption that I would accept the surface terms and avoid deeper review. I closed the document and stood, carrying it with measured steps down the hallway toward the study. I knocked once before entering. Thomas looked up from his laptop, his expression guarded but confident. "You received the proposal," he said, not asking but confirming. I placed the papers on his desk without sitting. "I did," I replied. "It is thorough in some areas." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "It is more than fair," he said. "I wanted to ensure you are comfortable." Comfortable. The word echoed faintly in the room. I thought about the years I balanced comfort with ambition, the times I reassured him during market downturns, the seasons when I quietly adjusted household expenses so he could reinvest in growth. Comfort had always been something I created, not something handed to me. "There are omissions," I said evenly, "specifically regarding the trust shares and the postnuptial amendment." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Those matters are marginal," he replied. "The company has evolved. The newer structures supersede earlier arrangements." I met his gaze steadily. "They do not supersede contractual protections triggered by attempted asset relocation," I said. The room grew still. Outside the window, a lawn service truck idled at the curb, its engine humming steadily as if unaware of the shift taking place inside. Thomas removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk. "You are overcomplicating this," he said. "Dragging this out will only create unnecessary tension for the children." The children? It was an effective appeal. I allowed a brief pause before answering. "Clarity does not create tension," I said. "Assumptions do." I turned toward the bookshelf and gently straightened one of the framed photographs of Claire's college graduation. I remembered that day vividly, the pride in Thomas's voice as he introduced himself as her father to every professor in sight. He had always valued recognition. What he had not recognized was the quiet architecture supporting his achievements. "My attorney will be responding," I continued. "The amendment's provisions are not symbolic. They are binding." For the first time since the anniversary night, I saw genuine calculation flicker across his face. He had expected negotiation. He had not expected resistance anchored in documentation. "You are willing to jeopardize significant capital over principle?" he asked. I faced him squarely. "I am unwilling to relinquish what was built jointly because you prefer a simplified narrative," I replied. The words did not need volume to carry weight. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing not in anger but in reassessment. I gathered the proposal papers and held them lightly at my side. "This does not have to be adversarial," I added, "but it will be accurate." As I left the study and walked back toward the kitchen, I felt neither triumph nor fear, only alignment. The envelope that had arrived as a declaration now felt like a catalyst. He had attempted to define the terms. I had merely clarified them. And in the quiet rhythm of our familiar house, I understood that the real negotiation had only just begun. The response from my attorney was delivered with the same measured precision I had come to respect in her. A carefully drafted counterproposal that did not raise its voice yet altered the entire landscape. I reviewed it at the dining room table, sunlight filtering through the tall windows and casting long rectangles across the polished wood, where we had once hosted holiday dinners and birthday celebrations. The language was calm, factual, anchored in contract law and documented timelines. It outlined the triggering of the postnuptial clause due to unilateral asset transfers, detailed the valuation of the original corporate shares still registered under the family trust, and referenced the refinancing provision in a way that shifted the burden away from me. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just clarity written in ink. When Thomas received a copy later that afternoon, he did not come to me immediately. I heard him pacing in the study, the faint rhythm of footsteps moving back and forth across the hardwood floor. By evening, he appeared in the doorway of the living room where I was reading, his posture less rigid than usual. "You have escalated this unnecessarily," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I placed my bookmark carefully between the pages and looked up at him. "I have responded proportionately," I replied. He moved closer, hands resting on the back of an armchair. "The trust shares represent a controlling interest," he said. "You know what that implies for the company." I held his gaze steadily. I know exactly what it implies, I answered. That was the point. For years, the narrative of his success had been singular. He was the visionary, the architect, the public face. I had never challenged that perception. I did not need recognition to understand contribution. But ownership, once formalized, carries weight beyond applause. The following morning, we met with our respective attorneys in a conference room overlooking the Chicago River. The skyline stretched behind us, steel and glass reflecting late summer light, a reminder of the ambition that once bound us together. Thomas arrived in a tailored gray suit, composed but watchful. Diane sat beside me, a neat stack of documents aligned perfectly in front of her. The discussion began with routine formalities, then moved quickly into numbers. Valuations were projected onto a screen, percentages calculated, timelines outlined. Thomas's attorney emphasized liquidity concerns and operational continuity. Diane referenced contractual safeguards and fiduciary obligations. I listened more than I spoke, absorbing the shift in tone as the realization settled in. The amendment was enforceable. The transfers had indeed activated its protections. At one point, Thomas leaned back in his chair and studied me across the table. There was no anger in his expression now, only recognition. He understood that I had not reacted emotionally because I had prepared structurally. "What is it that you want?" he asked finally, his voice measured but direct. The room grew still. I folded my hands lightly on the table. "I want acknowledgement of shared foundation," I said. "And I want terms that reflect reality, not convenience." There was no need to raise my voice. The figures on the screen spoke loudly enough. The controlling interest in those early shares shifted leverage in a way he had not anticipated. If he pushed aggressively, he risked destabilizing the very company he intended to continue leading. If he negotiated fairly, we could reach an arrangement preserving both stability and dignity. The power dynamic was no longer assumed. It was balanced. After several hours, the outlines of a revised agreement began to form. The house would remain in my name without immediate refinancing pressure. The trust shares would be restructured in a way that compensated my controlling interest appropriately, while allowing operational continuity. The monthly support figures were adjusted to reflect long-term contribution, rather than short-term calculation. Nothing vindictive. Nothing excessive. Simply accurate. As we exited the building later that afternoon, the river below moved steadily, indifferent to personal upheaval. Thomas paused beside me on the sidewalk, traffic humming in the background. "I did not expect this," he admitted quietly. I looked at him, not with triumph but with clarity. "You expected silence," I said. "You received preparation." And in that moment, standing beneath the skyline we once admired as a symbol of shared ambition, I understood that the true shift had never been about ending a marriage. It had been about correcting an assumption. The revised terms did not finalize that day, but the direction was unmistakable. Over the next 2 weeks, drafts moved back and forth with decreasing friction. Language softened where it needed to, tightened where it mattered. I stayed involved in every review session, not because I distrusted Diane, but because I wanted to understand each sentence that would define the next chapter of my life. Thomas, for the first time in years, began asking my opinion directly rather than assuming it. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone observing from the outside, but I felt it in the tone of his voice and the way he waited for my response. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the long oak table, the final proposal printed neatly between us, he cleared his throat before speaking. "This preserves operational control," he said carefully, "and compensates you appropriately." Appropriately. I studied the numbers, the percentages, the structured buyout of my controlling trust shares over a defined period, the clause ensuring that any future asset restructuring required written consent from both parties. The house remained in my name outright. The retirement accounts were divided with recognition of historical contribution, not just current salary. It was balanced. Not sentimental. Not punitive. Balanced. I looked up at him and saw not the confident executive from the anniversary night, but a man confronting the consequences of assumption. "This is accurate," I said finally. The word carried weight because it was precise. Accuracy had replaced emotion. Over the following days, signatures were scheduled. Documents were notarized. Financial institutions were notified. Claire and Michael were informed together at the kitchen table, the same place where they had once done homework while I prepared dinner. There were tears from Claire, quiet frustration from Michael, but neither expressed shock at the separation itself. What surprised them was the stability in my voice. I explained the structure of the agreement in simple terms, reassuring them that the company would continue, and that their father and I would manage the transition with dignity. I did not mention leverage. I did not mention strategy. Those details belonged to me. A week later, Thomas moved into a downtown condominium overlooking the river, a sleek space of glass and steel that suited the streamlined narrative he preferred. I remained in the Winnetka house, walking through rooms that no longer felt divided. The marble foyer, the study, the patio with its quiet blue pool lights. Everything was familiar, yet lighter. The absence of tension has a sound of its own. It is not silence. It is ease. One afternoon I found myself standing in the study, now undeniably mine. The framed annual reports still lined the shelves. I removed one from the early years and opened it slowly. The numbers were modest compared to the present valuation, but they represented risk taken together. I closed the book gently and placed it back in its spot. My phone vibrated with a message from Diane confirming that the final buyout schedule had been executed, and the initial transfer completed. The controlling interest had been acknowledged, structured, and respected. Later that evening Thomas called. His voice sounded steady, perhaps even reflective. "I underestimated you," he said without preamble. There was no accusation in the statement, only recognition. I considered his words carefully before responding. "You underestimated the foundation," I said. "I simply remembered it." After we ended the call, I walked out to the backyard. The late summer air carried the faint scent of cut grass from a neighboring yard. I sat in one of the patio chairs and watched the pool lights flicker on automatically as dusk settled. For 40 years I had defined myself in partnership. Now I defined myself in clarity. The difference was not dramatic. It was structural. He had believed the evening at the country club would mark the decisive turn. In truth, the decisive turn occurred long before that, in quiet meetings, in careful reading, in the steady refusal to collapse. What I revealed was never a secret weapon. It was documentation. It was preparation. It was the understanding that composure is not weakness, and silence is not ignorance. And as the water reflected the fading light of the sky, I understood that the real shift had not been in the balance sheet. It had been in the balance of respect. Autumn arrived quietly that year, the leaves along our street in Winnetka turning shades of amber and deep red as if nothing significant had shifted behind the brick facades and trimmed hedges. The paperwork was complete, the accounts restructured, the buyout schedule initiated exactly as negotiated. On paper, it looked like a standard dissolution between two financially literate adults. In reality, it was the correction of a long-standing imbalance. I began rising earlier than usual, not from anxiety but from habit, and I found a certain peace in walking through the house while it was still dark. The kitchen felt different now, not because the furniture had changed, but because the tension had dissolved. I brewed coffee and stood at the window watching the sun lift slowly over Lake Michigan in the distance. For the first time in months, my thoughts were not racing ahead to strategy or documentation. They were steady. Thomas and I maintained occasional communication regarding the structured transfer of shares. The first scheduled payment cleared without delay, deposited precisely as outlined. I reviewed the confirmation on my laptop, noting the transaction number and timestamp, then closed the screen without ceremony. There was no satisfaction in the number itself. The satisfaction came from accuracy, from acknowledgement formalized. One afternoon, Claire stopped by with her 2 children, filling the house with the kind of laughter that echoes off high ceilings and polished floors. I watched my grandson run down the hallway that had once felt tense and realized how much atmosphere shapes memory. The house was no longer a battleground of unspoken calculations. It was simply a home again. Later that week, I attended a small board reception at the company headquarters at Thomas's invitation. The setting was formal but subdued, a private room overlooking the river. When I entered, several executives greeted me with polite surprise. My presence had not been expected in recent months. Thomas approached me near the windows, his demeanor composed but measured. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded. "It is still partly mine," I replied, not with defiance but with fact. During his remarks to the board, he acknowledged the restructuring process in general terms, referring to the importance of honoring foundational commitments. He did not elaborate and he did not need to. The room understood the implication. Afterward, as the city lights reflected off the glass towers outside, he stood beside me in quiet conversation. There was no bitterness in his tone now, only something close to respect. "You built more of this than I allowed myself to see," he said. I considered the skyline for a moment before answering. "We built it," I replied. I simply refused to be written out of the blueprint. Weeks turned into months. The legal finalization moved from active negotiation to administrative closure. I repainted the study a lighter shade, replaced the heavy drapes with simple linen panels, and rearranged the furniture so the desk faced the window rather than the wall. Small changes. Structural shifts. I reopened an old file containing lesson plans from my years teaching part-time, and began exploring volunteer opportunities at a local literacy center. My days were no longer defined by someone else's calendar. They were defined by intention. Occasionally, I thought back to that evening under the crystal chandelier, the moment when he believed he had seized control of the narrative. I remembered the weight of the champagne glass in my hand and the steadiness of my voice. I had not won through spectacle. I had prevailed through preparation, through documentation, through the quiet understanding that long marriages are not erased by a single announcement, nor are decades of contribution nullified by a single decision. As winter approached and the first frost silvered the edges of the backyard grass, I stood once more by the pool lights at dusk. The air was colder now, sharper against my skin. I wrapped a wool shawl around my shoulders and watched the water ripple gently in the artificial glow. He had believed he was divorcing a dependent wife. In truth, he was negotiating with a partner who remembered every signature, every risk, every foundation stone laid. I did not lose my home. I did not lose my share. I did not lose my composure. What I lost was an illusion. And in its place I gained something far more enduring. The knowledge that silence can hold strength, and that the quietest detail revealed at the right time can reshape an entire story.